Esperamos 2 minutos y ya está.
Okay. Hello, everyone. We are going to still wait like 1 or 2 minutes so that more of you can connect, and then we will start our live webinar.
Hi, Adrianna.
Hello, Jordi.
Since long time, I'm not speaking English. I will try to...
Me neither. We're going to have fun today.
For sure. You are forgotten, no? Your English?
Yes, I already forgot my English.
Because you speak Spanish every day, almost Catalan also, and Polski.
Polski, oh, okay. Very well, Jordi. Wow,
Okay.
I'm impressed.
Thank you. You have to give me a class of English every day, but it's not possible with the work that we have.
No.
Sometimes we try to speak in English, but it's not possible because we want to go directly to the point and we speak in Spanish.
That's true.
We are going to wait 1 minute and we will start with the introduction of what we are going to do today.
Many of you connect probably from different parts of the world, so also maybe it's morning or late at night, in some places. So
sure.
We don't know if to say good morning or good afternoon or
goodbye.
Good night. We are here in the afternoon in Spain, 4 p.m.
With a really beautiful sun that we have today. I think that we can start, no? Marta,
yes.
It's okay?
Okay, so since there's already more of you connected, so once again, hello and welcome everyone. In this webinar, together with Jordi, we want to tell you all you ever wanted to know about Syneresis. So to begin with, maybe you're already familiar with the word Syneresis, or if not, you can just imagine it as water leaking, right? Like some water leaking out of your cake, of your pastry cream, maybe of your glaze, right? And it's a very common pastry problem, and it happens to the best of the chefs. It's not something to be ashamed of, but if you want to forget this problem ever existed in your pastries, listen carefully, because today we will give you a lot of tips and advice on how to build stable recipes, right, that will not have Syneresis. So to begin with, maybe Jordi, you want to tell us, why do we always go back to Syneresis? Why do we always keep explaining this? How did you actually discover this, or how did you come to understand this concept?
I can explain my personal history behind this problem, because this started many years ago when I started in pastry, that I started to work with recipes, French recipes of mousses, compotes, creamies. And some days in some products, I had this problem. I had water leaking out and Syneresis. And the problem for me was, I don't understand this situation. Why one day I'm working in one recipe and it's working perfect. I can freeze the freeze and I don't have this kind of problems. And then another day I'm going to produce the same recipe and I have this problem. And for this reason, I started to... I was working as a pastry chef, and then when we won the Coupe du Monde in 2011, I started to try to understand all these problems in pastry. And I remember the first time that I was working in recipes after the Coupe du Monde, that I was calling my friends, because I had maybe one presentation, one demo with products, and I have this problem in my products, and I was calling my friends, and everybody tell me always, you can put more gelatin in order to solve this problem, And this was not the right answer, Because when you put more gelatin, at the end, what you are doing is to make more harder
the gel is harder.
It's harder. You lose your creamy texture, and even sometimes using a lot of jelly agents, or gelatin, still have this problem. You have Syneresis, And we started in 2011 to work in order to develop our method, the big concept method, and I was really focused on this, on trying to understand what was the problem on the recipes, because this problem we had in this kind of textures, but then when we have baked products like tarts, like sponges, you never have this problem. Okay. You have this problem always when you are working in recipes that you have a lot of water, in presence. And a lot of tests, a lot of work behind this, and was 2 years working and trying to find a solution. And And finally, we find a solution. We know now exactly why we have this problem on the recipes, and we can explain and we can share with all of you. And today we are going to explain the key things that you have to understand in your recipes in order to manage this situation that we have in sometimes in mousses, in compotes, in creamies, and in general, when more watery ingredients we have, like we use fruits, like for example in compotes, in jellies, we have more this problem because naturally the ingredients that we are using contains more water, and we have to work harder in order to fix all this water in our recipe.
Exactly, to keep it in place so that it doesn't move and so that it doesn't leak out, especially after the freeze and thaw process.
And this is a little bit the beginning of our history behind the Syneresis.
Yes, why do we keep talking about Syneresis? But I think it's because if we look at sometimes the questions, right, that many pastry chefs from all around the world are sending to you, to your Instagram, or you are writing to us by mail, right? Many times we find pictures of your cakes, right? And pictures with this little water around, and you are asking us like, what is the problem with my recipe? So one day we decided to make this list of common pastry problems, right? And Syneresis is one of the top 10 or even top 3 problems that pastry chefs have. And one of the problems that is, I would say, not so well understood, because there are some problems that if we overcook, if we overcook our pastry cream, or if something, it's easy to understand where does the error come from. But when we make a mousse, the mousse is perfect when we make it, right? Then we freeze it, and then when we defrost it, we see the water and we don't understand what happened there. So
at the end in pastry, Adrianna, I think that we have a lot of schools that explain the recipes and explain how to produce these recipes, but doesn't explain too much about the ingredients, about behind everything that we are doing. No, because I remember when I won the Coupe du Monde, I was thinking, okay, I win this competition, but I don't know nothing.
I still have some questions.
Behind a lot of questions, and more you try to go deep inside of the recipes and inside of the ingredients, more questions you are doing to your.
Exactly, and I think it's very interesting because we will explain you Syneresis, I think, in a simple manner, just telling you what exactly happens during the freeze and thaw process, for example. Because I think maybe you think Syneresis is this complex, very complex reaction or very complex phenomenon that we find in our cakes that are composed of many textures. But actually, we deal with Syneresis every day, right? I want to talk a little bit maybe about some common examples from everyday life that every day we see Syneresis. Because for example, if you open your fridge and take a pot of yogurt, and you open the lid and you actually see that there's a little bit of like this clear watery part on top, you think maybe, it's not well mixed, something happened here. Actually, this is Syneresis. Your yogurt is also a gel, and this water is the water that was actually expulsed from the gel. So this is Syneresis. Or sometimes when you open the bottle of ketchup, and there's first, before the ketchup comes out, there comes out this
little bit of water.
Clear water, exactly. Why? Because ketchup, if you think about it, it's also a gel. Ketchup and tomatoes contain a lot of pectin, so it's a gel made with pectins. And then if the gel is if the gel is either too strong or too weak, or if we have any problem if we don't have any thickening agent, nowadays usually they put xanthan gum in the ketchup, so you have less of this problem, and less because people didn't like when they opened the ketchup, and they didn't like this water leakage. So all the manufacturers they fix the problem, right? But if we use a type of ketchup with no added texturizing agents, we might see the Syneresis because the water is being expulsed from the gel.
these are the different kinds of syneresis that we can find every day.
These are the examples, the most common examples that even like some ingredients, right? It doesn't have to be a big pastry cake like an entremet with a lot of layers, right? We can see syneresis in something so simple as yogurt or ketchup. But so these were examples. But if we talk about types, it could be good to say like what actually leads to syneresis, right? Because we can have different processes that end up with syneresis, right? Why this water is being expulsed from the gel. So we can say that the most common problem in pastry is when we freeze and thaw a recipe, right? This is one, let's say, one line, one thing that can lead us to syneresis, and we will further on we will comment why exactly. But also overcooking of proteins, exactly, where we also have a gel, we have coagulated proteins, but when we overcook them, also the water is expulsed from the gel. So this is another case. And even if we're trying to whisk a meringue and we overbeat the egg whites, what we will have is also the water or the air in this case also can be expulsed from from our gel, from our texture. So there are many different ways that can, let's say, many different processes, right, or errors that we can make that end up in syneresis. But the most, let's say, the one that that is or most common or that is very problematic for the pastry chefs is the one after the freeze and thaw process, because they don't understand why the texture was perfect before freezing and after defrosting.
You have this kind of problems. And I remember also when I started in all these things and we started to create a method in order to explain to the pastry chef how to create recipes from scratch, one of my goals was try to reduce fats and sugars, no? And more fats you try to reduce in order to adjust the recipes, and more sugar you reduce. These are the two key ingredients that we use in classic pastry that give us dry extract, we can say, on the recipes. No? And I had more and more problems with the syneresis, no? Because I was trying to remove butter, for example, in a lemon cream because was too dairy taste on the lemon cream, and I was trying to reduce the percentage. I was adding other ingredients, but without any knowledge in order to adjust this situation. And the problem was always the same. The more I tried to reduce this kind of ingredients that was too much for me on the recipes, the more I had this problem because I was adding water to the recipes. No? And these situations bring me to have more and more problems with syneresis, no?
I think it's normal because it's exactly how you said, Jordi. Traditional classic recipes, now that maybe haven't changed in the past 100 years, right? They don't have problem with syneresis for two reasons. Either because they contain such a big amount of fats and sugars that actually there's very little water that can later be expelled from the gel. But also the second reason is that sometimes they weren't even they weren't even supposed to be frozen, right? They were the cakes to like let's say pâte sablée, right, with pastry cream, with fresh fruit.
Was prepared and just
exactly prepared and sold on the same day, or maybe in the fridge, but never frozen and defrosted. So actually there's a lot of things that have changed in pastry, and with these changes we come across the syneresis problem more and more. So that's where the need to really understand this phenomenon comes from.
If we analyze a classic recipe of, for example, chocolate mousse, we have a crème anglaise that contains fat that comes from the cream that we have on the crème anglaise. We have fat from the egg yolks. All this is dry extract on the recipe. We have water also because these ingredients contains water naturally present, but we have a lot of dry extract. Then we go to the chocolate that we use in this kind of mousses, and we are using 30-40% of chocolate. That all this percentage is dry extract because we don't have almost water on the chocolate. And then we add whipping cream on this kind of recipes. Whipping cream has around 40% of dry extract. That means that this kind of recipes, classic recipes of chocolate mousse, we can find really easy 55, even 60% of dry extract. And these recipes, you can travel to the other side of the world and there is no problem of syneresis, even if you freeze it, freeze for such quantity of fats and sugar that we have inside.
If you think about it, 60% of dry extract, Jordi, is actually the amount of dry extract in a cake, right? In a sponge cake or in a fruit cake. So it's crazy to think that you can have the same amount of dry extract, right? In a crème anglaise or in a pastry cream, but the classic recipes, they were like that. They were actually controlling, let's say, the stability of the recipe by adding more sugars or more fats. So one thing I think that maybe just to sum up this little introduction about what syneresis is and what types of syneresis we have, right? One thing that I want to make clear is like a simple definition, so that we stay with this definition, right? That syneresis, we understand syneresis as this water leakage, right? But to put it in one sentence, syneresis is basically water that is expelled outside of a gelled texture. So whether it is, we can have syneresis with any texture. We can have, well, maybe not with cakes usually because of the amount of dry extract. So there's little water being expelled, but you can have experience syneresis with creamies, pastry creams. You can experience syneresis a lot with mousses, with gelled. Exactly. Cheesecakes. Yes.
Even bake it on the oven and you can have this
exactly
problem.
That's true. Then you can experience syneresis with glazes, right? A lot, especially.
We have to explain that sometimes we have, I think in English it's condensation outside.
Yes.
It's
condensation.
That is
it's
two
not the same.
different things, because sometimes we are confused on this. And one thing is the syneresis, what you explained it, no, this water linking out of the texture. And another thing is when we have condensation, that we have a difference more than 7 degrees between the product and the atmosphere that we have around. And there is the water that we have in the atmosphere that is going to be not absorb, que se pone.
Yes, it will just like surround the texture, right?
And this water, when you have, for example, you remove a product from the freeze and you remove directly outside at 20 degrees, all this water is going to arrive to the product, but then this product at the beginning is frozen. And that means that this water is going to be freeze. But then when this product will be at 4 degrees, that is the temperature that we are going to eat this product, this pastry product, we will see the water linking out around of the product. This is condensation. And the problem here, the solution is just to avoid this changing of temperature.
Difference of temperature.
No, we have to bring from the freezer to the fridge
and not outside. Yes.
And it's not completely different for this reason. For example, when we are going to prepare a recipe and do a test of syneresis, we always cover with clean film in contact in order to avoid this problem about the condensation. And like that, we have the condensation outside of the clean film. And when we remove, what we see, if there is water around, this is syneresis.
Exactly, that's true, because sometimes when we have some water beads, right, on top of our texture, like we think, oh, this is syneresis. No, but usually the water, the syneresis we will experience is as the water that is on the bottom, right, like around our texture or our cake, and not a little bit on top, like in the case of condensation. So I think that the second big point is like to when we talk about syneresis, we have to talk about water, right, Jordi? Like we have to go back to the basics, because actually that's what Jordi was talking about. Like in pastry school, I don't think I have
the water that we use in pastry, and we don't know at
exactly
the beginning
how to work that we are using water.
We are using water
Yes.
Because milk contains a lot of water, the fruit purees contains a lot of water, cream contains a lot of water.
Exactly, we don't think
about the water that is behind.
Yes, like pastry chefs work with water every single day, but they never think they work with water unless they pour pure water right into their recipe. So it's very curious, because I think maybe even savory chefs have more conscience that they are constantly working with water, right? By boiling, cooking, maybe they have it a little more like obvious, right? That this is what we are working with every day. But actually, as pastry chefs, we work every single day with water. Even butter has water, right? Butter has around 15% of water, and we never stop to think about it. And I always explain that, like, in all the pastry books that I had, all the pastry classes that I took, like, I remember that, like, the explanations are about milk or cream or butter, right? Or flours. But actually, there's no one that explains you what are the properties of water? What are the physical or physicochemical properties of water? And actually, it's probably one of your most important ingredient, one that you find in almost all the ingredients that you use. And you need to understand very well how to work with water, because it's exactly this water that might later end up giving you problems with syneresis. So if we go back to link this, to make a connection, right, between syneresis and water, maybe let's start with saying what is dry extract, right? We have on one hand dry extract. What is water? And in the world of water, we can have free water or water that we controlled water, right? So maybe we start with explaining this.
I can explain, Adrianna, if you want, what is dry extract on the ingredients. Dry extract on the ingredients is the addition of, if I say something wrong, you just tell us. Is the addition of carbohydrates that we have in the nutritional fact of the information of an ingredient is carbohydrates, where inside of carbohydrates we have fibers and sugars, then we have proteins, we have fats, and we have
proteins, fats, starch.
That's it. Carbohydrates, fiber, proteins, and fats, and inside the carbohydrates we have fibers and sugars. Okay, it's addition of these three ingredients, and then we have vitamins and minerals.
Which are such small quantities, but we can say that they are also, like, they make part of dry extract.
That means that when we want to understand how much dry extract we have in an ingredient, we have to find the nutritional information about this ingredient that we are using, and just add all these ingredients, and we will have a percentage.
It's the sum of all these ingredients, right?
For example, here we have cream. In cream, we have around 42% of dry extract. It depends how much fat we are using on the cream. This is a cream with 35% of fat, and this 35% of fat is dry extract. But then we have other proteins.
Exactly. You have about if I'm not mistaken, between 2 and 3% of milk proteins in.
And we have some sugars.
Exactly. Also, you have lactose. So when you do when you add all of these, as you said, the sum of all of these gives you the total amount of dry extract, and then around 60% of whipped cream is just pure water, but we don't think about it as water. And then we are surprised that if we make a creamy or some cream with whipped cream, then we end up having the syneresis problem. But we can, because this is 60% of water. So if this water is not controlled within our recipe, then it will have the tendency to want to go out, because there is nothing, right? There is nothing controlling and keeping this water from leaking.
And then we have other examples like fruit purees that we are using in pastry. And here it's really simple, because we have almost only carbohydrates, and inside of carbohydrates we have sugars, and we have fibers. Here we have passion fruit that we have around more or less 25% of dry extract, and here we have a big quantity of carbohydrates as a sugar, some fibers, around 9%. That is not bad, the quantity of fibers that we have in this fruit, because we can see that it's almost liquid, but we have more or less 9% of fibers, and then we have some proteins, some fats we can find, but in really a small quantity, And that means that when we are working with fruits, we have a high quantity of water naturally present. And then we can say chocolates that the 100% of chocolate that we are using in our recipe is 100% of dry extract, because here we don't have almost water. We can find 1, 2,
maybe it will be 1%.
3%. But here, even when we are going to formulate our recipe, we are not going to calculate the water that we have in this kind of product. But for sure, in this kind of ingredients, for sure we have to know this information, and we have to use it in order to balance perfectly our recipe. And then on the fats that we use, for example, in pastry, we have butter that we use a lot, and we have water, and this water is really important. No, for example, when we are going to make a crumble classic recipe of crumble, that we are using butter, and we try to replace this butter in order to create a recipe without lactose, for example, and we want to use coconut oil. We have to replace the part of the fat that we have in butter, but also on the recipe we have to replace the water that we have inside of butter, because if not, the dough is not going to have a smoothy texture in order to use, and the baking process will be not correct. That means that even for sure in baked textures, it's really important. It's really important to understand where is the water and how, for example, in order to replace on the recipes that we are trying to adjust to some different necessities, no? And all these products that we have here, sugar, coconut sugar, inulin, oligofructose, that are fibers, all these products are almost 100% dry extract.
Exactly. So I think in summary we can go back to your definition of dry extract, because I remember, Jordi, when I first came to the B Concept course, and I remember, like, you were always saying, right, dry extract is basically everything that is not water. Right? So yes, in butter we have this little part of water. Everything else is dry extract. In fruit puree or in whipped cream, right? Everything like proteins, carbohydrates, fats, right? Everything that is not water is dry extract. And sometimes we get confused because we think that dry extract has to be hard. It cannot be liquid, right? Mm-hmm. So when we see butter is let's say a different case. But if we had here olive oil or any type of oil, right, vegetable oil,
we see completely liquid.
We see liquid, and we think no, this is, maybe it's not water, but it's not dry extract either. But it is. Because we define dry extract, right, and it will give us stability in as far as our recipes go. So in the end, we have to make this distinction, right? Dry extract, everything that is not water, and then the other part of the recipe typically would be water if we have these types of ingredients. And then if we had very hard dry ingredients, maybe the water content will be as little as 1% or 0.5. Even flowers have something like 1% humidity, right? Mm-hmm. So you can think, even for sugar, sometimes the technical file says 99% of like dry extract, right? And the 1% is a little bit, tiny bit of humidity that this product has.
And sometimes in some countries that has a lot of humidity, all these products that are dry, they are going to absorb water, and this water will be inside of the recipe when we are going to use them on the recipes. But in general, when we think in this kind of products, we think that almost 100% is dry extract. And when we do our calculations using chocolates, pralines, nut paste,
nut butters or nut paste, see?
Yeah. All these ingredients, coconut oil, are ingredients that are almost 100% of dry extract, and that give us a lot of dry extract on the recipes, and this is going to translate on the stability of the recipe that we will explain.
Exactly, in a moment. But let's stay with the water for a little bit longer, Jordi, if we mind. So now, once we have it clear, what is dry extract, what is the water content of our recipes, let's talk a little bit about how can this water exist within our recipes, right? Because this water is not always the same. This water can be what we call free water, or this water can be what we can call controlled water or bound water and trapped water, right? And it's very important to understand the distinction, because if we have the free water, it's actually the water that is not bound to any dry extract like sugars or fats, right? Like or fibers. And this is exactly this water that will give us problems of syneresis. And then when we have captured water, controlled water, right? Whether it's physically captured within a gel, right, in a three-dimensional network, or whether it's captured with ingredients that have thickening capacities like fibers, right, or many other thickening agents, then this water doesn't have the freedom to, let's say, to move and and like break our recipe stability. So it's very important to understand that the more water in our recipes we have, the more control over this water we need, because the uncontrolled water, the free water, is actually what ends up leaking out of our textures.
For this reason, we are going to control the dry extract on the recipes. We can start to explaining this. Adrianna, you want to explain more?
Yes, I only want one last point, Jordi, because if we may, you can help me explain like what exactly happens when you freeze and thaw this recipe, really because this is the last point about water that I think we are not always conscious about.
I think everybody knows that when we are going to freeze water, we are going to win volume. No, now we have this water here. Just as one example, if we are going to freeze this water on the freezer, tomorrow we will have like a kind of mountain here.
Exactly.
No? That means that the water is going to expand when we are going to freeze it. No?
If anyone, I think we all have this experience of putting a water bottle, right? Yes. Like water bottle, full water bottle, plastic water bottle in the fridge, and then it's like.
And then we have.
Or if it's a glass, if it's a glass bottle, it can lead to an explosion. But if it's a plastic bottle, then it kind of like expands, right? And this is because basically water molecules, right, like reorganize themselves when they change their physical state, and they gain volume. Water gains about 10% of volume while changing its physical state, right? We will not get into details exactly why, because that's already let's say the molecule level, but it's very important at least to have this fact in mind, that every time we are putting a texture with a lot of water to freeze and we're going to freeze it and defrost it, we are actually, this water will, especially the free water in the recipe, will expand. And what happens then? While it expands,
like a knife, we can say that breaks.
The water turns into crystals, ice crystals. It's not water anymore, because during the process of freezing, the water changes into ice. So the ice crystals are actually expanding. And if before we had a very nice texture with a three-dimensional, right, like gel created, and the free water was actually entrapped, right, was inside of this structure, those crystals will act like, as you say, as scissors or knives, and they will cut. Right, they will cut through this three-dimensional network, and the network will not hold all this water anymore. So what happens after we defrost our texture is this
free water.
Exactly.
This, water that we transform it in ice crystals will be part of this water. Will be like the linking water that we can find, and will be the syneresis. And this is a problem that we have to control in pastry. In order to avoid this, we have to adjust all that we are going to explain now, but also is important to understand the kind of freezing process that we are using. No, the faster is our freezing process, the smaller will be these ice crystals.
Exactly,
ice crystals, and less aggressive will be for the recipe this freezing and thaw process. No, and for this reason, always when we are producing a kind of modern pastry like entremets, petit gâteau, we try to use a blast freezer in order to go the most fast than is possible between 4 degrees, we can say 4 degrees, 2 degrees, until we have -8, -10 degrees, and we have the water that we transform it on ice crystals. No, and this process in this range of the
temperature
needs to be the faster than is possible. No, for this reason, blast freezers are really interesting in order to avoid to have this big ice crystals and break all these structures that we created when we are creating our creme anglaise, for speaks about the classic recipes, and we created a perfect net with all the proteins that we have inside, our emulsifiers, and everything is perfect, but then we freeze, and we break everything that we created on the recipe.
Exactly.
In order to avoid this problem, it's really important to fix all these things that we are going to explain now, but also it's important how we are going to freeze the more longer time we will have in order to freeze a product, the bigger
the bigger the crystals, right, or the bigger the Syneresis problem, because in the end, the freezing time and the how fast, right, we can drop the temperature to, let's say, -20 or minus 30 or -18. How fast we can get there. This influences like the structure, right, of the crystals that are formed. And a couple of weeks ago, I think we might recommend the exercise for those of you who have a blast chiller like in your pastry shop. You can just do a simple experiment a couple of weeks ago with Adrianna, which is a member of our R&D team. She made this little experiment to show, right, exactly the Syneresis with a simple example of strawberries. You can take fresh strawberries and take the same batch and just put it in your home freezer, which usually has like -18, but in reality more like -14. And if you have a lot of things in your freezer, maybe it even doesn't reach -12. And then you can put the second batch of the same strawberries, right, in a blast chiller. And what you will see
blast chiller or blast freezer? What is the difference? I know.
That's a good question.
Minus 40 degrees, we can say. Is blast chiller for you?
Yes, you can. But blast freezer is also perfect. I think actually the two words are correct. Blast freezer, blast chiller.
The difference, to see the difference between to freeze at -12 and -40 degrees.
Exactly. So you will see that after the freeze and thaw cycle, right? And when you actually defrost the strawberries, like, it's incredible the amount of water that leaks from the strawberries frozen in your home freezer. And then the other actually didn't even show, just not even a little bit. And it's incredible.
Incredible.
If you think that strawberries, I think, are at least 70 or 80%, almost 90% of water.
And you see how it changes the way that we freeze a product, how it's going to change the linking water and the shelf life also of the structure that we have.
Exactly. So this is an important point to have in mind, because also sometimes some pastry chefs ask us like, oh, what if I don't have a blast chiller or blast freezer, right? Like, can I make the same texture, the same cake, the same entremet with my home freezer? And we say like maybe, but maybe the result will not be the same, exactly. And you might have some stability issues because the temperature in your freezer is very different, and you might not get, for example, you will be trying to take the entremet out of the mold, and it will not go out as smoothly because it's not as frozen as it should be, right? So that's another point, but more to let's say pastry home cooks, right, that are asking us these questions. So maybe we move on to explain now, like, where do we get this stability, this recipe stability and water control? How do we get there with our recipes?
The first solution that we need, or the first thing that we need to understand, is that in a recipe we need always a minimum of dry extract. We need a minimum of dry extract than 30%, more or less, and this dry extract is going to help us the water that we have on the recipe. That means
you can already see on the picture, yes. Like on the screen, you can see what Jordi is talking about. I think we will be like putting it and then like taking it off and then putting it again, so you can assimilate all the concepts.
That means that always when we are going to formulate a recipe, we will try to have more or less minimum around 30% of this dry extract. This can change a little bit. It depends the capacity of this dry extract of catch water. No, that means that it's not the same. For example, if we are going to use fibers on the recipe, or even using two different fruits. Imagine that we are going to work in a classic recipe with cream, with a meringue, and we are working in a recipe like we can see now. Everything is okay?
Yes. I'm saying like we will be going back and forth to the image, because if not, Jordi, we stay either with you or either with the image for 40 minutes without switching. So let's just do it like from time to time when we introduce the next concept, we will be putting it again. So if you haven't had the time to take notes, don't worry, we will go back to the image in some time.
That means that we need a minimum of dry extract of around 30%, and this dry extract is going to give us the stability that we need on the recipe. This is a minimum, more or less, that we need on the recipes, and also we have to consider that it depends how the water catchment capacity is of this ingredient that we are using, of this dry extract. We will have more or less stability. What was explaining was that here we are using a raspberry. We have a raspberry mousse. Raspberry contains fiber, but not too much, 2, 3, 4% maximum. And then we have another fruit that is like, for example, passion fruit, that we have 9% of fiber. The difference between this and this fruit will be that this fruit, passion fruit, is going to give us much more stability than raspberry puree. This is because we have this fiber that has more water catchment capacity. We know that fibers has this big water catchment capacity that we need in pastry, and we can use it in order to control the water that we have on the recipe. But this is the first thing that we have to control. We have to control dry extract in our recipes, and we need a minimum of 30%. What happens in recipes like, for example, compotes or jellies, that we are using such big quantity of fruits, is really easy to not arrive to this percentage. To this 30%. And what happens is that then when we are going to freeze and thaw this kind of textures, sometimes we will have this problem, no? And this is because maybe at the beginning we don't have the minimum of quantity of dry extract that we need to fix all this water. This can be fibers, this can be the sugars that we are using, that we add on this kind of textures, but also it depends the water catchment capacity of these ingredients, this dry extract that we are using on the recipe. This will be a small problem or a big problem, in order to have more or less water linking out of the recipe. That means that we need to control dry extract, we need to control the water catchment capacity of the ingredients.
Exactly. And if
you want to add something more, Adrianna, feel free.
Well, I think Jordi, we can focus right now a little bit on the water catching capacity of various ingredients, right? Because it's not the same, just like you said, it's not the same to make the same raspberry mousse with 10% of sugar or 20% of sugar. And if we do it with 20% of fiber, it will be a totally different recipe, right? Because of the water catching capacity and between the difference of the water catching capacity between sugars and fibers. So even within the same, let's say molecule group, the polysaccharides, right? Polysaccharides. Well, carbohydrates, because polysaccharides are only fibers. Even within the same group of carbohydrates, we have sugars, right? And then we have polysaccharides like fibers or starch that have a completely different water catching capacity. So when we are constructing our recipes, right, and we are, just like you said, we are not arriving at 30%, well, the only solution, let's say, would be to switch to an ingredient that has much more water catching capacity. Or another possibility would be to use some texturizing agents, hydrocolloids, like gums that have an excellent water catching capacity at very low concentration, so that they help us control all this free water.
In this direction, in order to understand this perfectly, Adrianna, something that we do in our course is just to mix 50% of water and 50% of sugar, and we blend with the hand mixer, and we will have like a kind of syrup at 20, 30 degrees. And then we can do exactly the same with fibers. With inulin, for example, native inulin or hot inulin, like we can know in Sosa company. And we can mix 50% of this fiber and 50% of water blended, and we can see that is a completely huge difference, that we have the sugar with the water that is completely liquid and will be like that always, no? And even if we have more and more time, will be exactly liquid, 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 and then we have the fiber that is going to absorb all this water that we have, all this 50% of water that we have, and we will have like a creamy,
yes, much
texture,
thicker,
or sometimes like
almost like semi-solid, right? Almost semi-solid it can turn. And I think here I cannot like not say something about the molecular structure of sugars versus fibers. I know it's this masterclass is, let's say, like accessible for all levels, so I hope I will explain it in an easy enough way. But just to understand why sugar does not capture as much water, why it cannot bind as much water as a fiber, you have to put it into perspective. Sugar, common table sugar, sucrose, right, is composed of two molecules, 1 unit of glucose and 1 unit of fructose. And then if you compare it to fiber, let's say inulin, native inulin, it can have 20 or 40 or even 60, right? A chain of 1 molecule of glucose and then up to 60 molecules of fructose. So if you just imagine it, it's the question, a little bit the question of size that influences the water catching capacity between and explains the difference between sugars and fibers. And it's very important to understand, because if one day, right, we want to substitute sugars for fibers, we need to take also this into account, because on one hand we have syneresis, but on the other hand, sometimes we can have the problem of too dry textures.
For sure.
When we work with too much fiber, or when we replace 20% of sugar with 20% of fiber, what happens is also we don't end up with a well-balanced recipe.
It is in baked products, we have this problem, for example, when we change a rice flour for coconut flour, no? That
exactly
is a completely different nutritional composition, and we have much more fiber in coconut flour.
43% of fiber in coconut flour. That's a flour with the most fiber. Well, technically, it's not a flour, because flours are supposed to be derived from different cereals. But let's say nowadays we call almond flour, hazelnut flour, and we call coconut flour. And so these flours have much higher fiber percentage than the regular cereal flours, but still among them, coconut is just the top level. Yes.
And here in this kind of recipes, we will need to adjust the water that we are using in order to balance the texture that we want. And when we work in recipes like, for example, mousses, creamies, and compotes, we have exactly the same. We can have, for example, in a chocolate mousse that we are using a chocolate, for sure. Chocolate contains cacao, and cacao contains fiber, and this fiber has the capacity to absorb a lot of water. If then we are going to use inulin, we are not going to balance the recipe on the right direction. We will have this dry texture at the end. Then that comes behind hour. No, we are going to, the more time pass, the more dry will be the texture, and we will have like a completely dry texture. Even sometimes when we work with a glass, and we put the chocolate mousse inside, we can see that this mousse is
it's contracted, right? It's like contracted because the fiber keeps like catching, and like binding the water, and the texture does not look the same, or sometimes it looks like a broken texture, right? Like if it's a chocolate ganache, it can look a little broken because it's drying out, basically.
That means that this fiber, they can help us in order to fix the water inside of the recipes. But if we are going to use too much, we are going to have this problem in our texture that will be dry, the texture, finally. And then we go.
Yes, the third point that we have, the third key factor that influence our texture stability?
We have to control the techniques that we are using in our recipes. Techniques, it means the step-by-step of a process that we are going to use in pastry for create, for example, to bring together fats and water, for example, emulsification. Emulsification is a technique that we use in a classic pastry, for example, when we are going to create a crème anglaise, and inside we have dairy products that has proteins that called caseins that have the capacity to emulsify and bring together fats and water that we have inside of this crème anglaise. And also we have egg yolks, and inside of the egg yolks we have lecithin that is also emulsifier. This is a technique that we call emulsification, but also we have another techniques that are aeration, thickening, gelation. All these techniques, they are going to help us in order to balance
our recipe and control
the water that we have.
But I think here we can go back to where we started, Jordi, because I think it's a common misconception that it's the gelation, right, that we need to control in order not to have syneresis, right? As you said, when we have syneresis, sometimes the common advice is like, oh, more gelatin or more pectin or more, right, of another, or we put more of another gelling agent. But it's actually a little bit, all the techniques can play a role in controlling syneresis, and very often it's the thickening that is the key, the technique to control syneresis.
Here we have an example.
Exactly, we will explain it to you in a minute. But just for you to understand, there are among the gelling agents, there are agents that are even like prone to syneresis. For example, agar-agar, which is now very popular, especially in vegan and vegetarian pastry, right, is an excellent gelling agent. But once you put it in the freezer and once you make it go through the freeze and thaw cycle, basically you end up with a pool of water. I have never seen as much water leaking out of any gelled texture as with agar-agar. And so you need to understand, like, even though it has this huge gelling capacity, it makes like those gels that are pretty hard, right, with a small concentration. Like, it doesn't have the stability during the freeze and thaw process, so it's not the best gelling agent if your texture is to be frozen, or you just have to work in pair. Exactly, work in team. Exactly, teamwork. You have to find out which thickening agent you can use, right, and which other techniques you can use in order not to have this problem. So sometimes, like, using a higher concentration of gelatin, of pectins, or of agar-agar is not the solution. The solution is to look a little bit into other techniques, other pastry techniques, and to see what else can I do to control this water. For example, emulsification. Before we go to thickening, I want to just go through emulsification one more time. What is an emulsion? Emulsion is a union of water and fat, right? And so by joining these two molecules, by forcing this union, right, we are binding this water. This water is no longer like free and available to do whatever it may want. So this is also a technique. When we use emulsification, it also allows us to control the free water. Then we can talk about thickening, because it's true, and Jordi, you can explain with an example, right? And we can talk a little bit more, and I'm sure you will have questions about some thickening agents that we can use to control syneresis, because thickening is a powerful technique, powerful tool in order to control the problem of syneresis. Why? Because for thickening, we usually use hydrocolloids, mostly we will use or starches or fibers, right? And these are the ingredients with a huge water catching capacity. So they are actually able to make this water kind of like to immobilize this water, right? To bind it so that it cannot leak even after the freeze and thaw process. Although even within the thickening technique, we have to be very conscious about which thickening agents are we going to work with, because what happens we make pastry cream with cornstarch,
for example,
and we freeze it, and we think, okay, thickening, I will control syneresis. I put a lot of cornstarch, I freeze my pastry cream, and when I defrost it,
I see that it's a soup. No?
Yes, or a broken texture, or we have a lot of syneresis. Why? because native starch is terrible at controlling syneresis. It's not resistant, right? Like it's very prone to syneresis, so it doesn't help us to control it. We have to switch to modified starches, and within modified starches we have to look for the ones that are stable against syneresis. So it's also true that just like not all gelling agents are very prone to syneresis, or some are better and some are, let's say, worse or more or less prone to syneresis. The same happens with thickening agents. Some help us control syneresis to a great extent, like xanthan gum, and some, like native starch, will be helpless. So this is the last point I wanted to make about the techniques. And if you want, Jordi,
I think that gelation can help us also to give us the structure on the water. That means that gelation is going to give us the structure that we want for the taste moment. No, I mean when you are going to consume this product, but also gelation is going to control the water that we have on the recipe. For this reason, at the beginning, I was calling my friends, and all of them tell me, "Oh, you need more gelatin, you need more gelatin." But at the end, if we are going to increase the gelatin and we don't have enough thickening technique on the recipe, or when we are not using the right process in order to build a perfect emulsification, the control will be zero. That means that we need a balance between emulsification in order, when we use emulsification in a recipe, to have a perfect emulsification. We need to use the right thickening agents in every recipe in order to adjust this situation and control this water that we have on the recipes. And then we need to adjust the quantity of gelation that we are using as a technique, and our jelly agents, in order to have the perfect texture that we want, creamy texture, or what kind of texture we have to build. That means that with these three techniques, we are going to control the water, and more techniques we are going to use in a recipe, more control we will have of the water.
Exactly.
It's not the same, for example, prepare a compote or jelly texture only using gelation and a jelly agent like, for example, gelatin or agar-agar or pectin, than if we are using the same recipe. On the same recipe, we are introducing the technique of thickening, and we will have like two family of ingredients that they are going to help us to control of this water that we have on the recipe. It happens sometimes that we have 30% of dry extract in our recipe, and we still have problems with the water. We have linking water, and you will think, wow, Jordi and Adrianna tell us that was 30% of dry extract minimum, but then we are going to prepare a recipe and we have 30% of dry extract, and still we have these problems. And this is because maybe you need to use or more techniques on your recipe, on your texture, or you need to increase the water catchment capacity of the dry extract that you are using. In a compote, for example, the easy example to understand this is that, in general, when we are going to prepare a compote texture or a jelly texture, we will have like fruits, puree, or fruits, we will have sugar, and we will have maybe gelatin or pectin, and we will have a recipe that I'm sure that we will have a small linking water linking out of the texture. But then here, if we add, for example, an thickening agent, like, for example, guar gum or guar gum, tara gum, xanthan gum,
locust bean
gum, we will have much more control of the water that we have on the recipe, and together with this 30% of dry extract that we need on the recipe, and these two techniques, we have much more control. That means that sometimes the solution is to increase dry extract. Sometimes the solution is to introduce more dry extract
with more water catching capacity.
That means that, for example, to change a part of the sugar for fiber, and this fiber that has much more water catchment capacity is going to help us to stabilize this situation. And sometimes the solution is or more techniques, or more water catchment capacity, or more dry extract. That means that when we have this problem in a recipe, we have to go in the middle of this We can say draw, no?
Yeah, so this drawing, right? Like, yes.
And the solution can be in any directions, no? To introduce more techniques, to introduce more water catchment capacity on the dry extract that we are using in our recipe, or to increase the quantity of dry extract that we have in our recipes.
Exactly. I think if you look at the graphic that is that you can see on your screen right now, again, right? Like in the middle, what you find is like if you consider all these three key factors, right, you will find the solution. If you analyze these three factors, it doesn't mean that always the way will be to have 30% to have of dry extract, to have an ingredient with a very high water catching capacity, and to have all four techniques. It's not always like this. But if you consider all the three factors and analyze your recipe, for sure you will find a solution, and you will give your texture stability. So I hope that these parts and the key factors to controlling your recipes are clear enough. And maybe just to clarify any doubts that you still have, like, would you like to
I think that we can stop just 2 minutes because we want to share with you the promotional video of the course.
Perfect.
Of the concept online course extended version, and we want to share this video with you. Just, I think it's 2 or 3 minutes. We stop, and then we are going to start to explain this example. I want to explain what was the solution in this raspberry mousse in order to clarify everything that we explained here. Hi, I'm Jordi Bordas, World Pastry Champion and the creator of the V-Concept method. Together with my team, I have created a unique online pastry course. Everything started when I was 14 years old, working in my parents' bakery. With time, I discovered that pastry was my language, my way to communicate and express myself. With a lot of training and experience under my belt, in 2011, I won the World Pastry Championship. This was a very special moment that became a turning point in my life. After becoming World Pastry Champion, I realized I wasn't free creating my recipes, and I started following a healthy lifestyle. But my recipes did not reflect that. I understood that the world has changed, but pastry remained the same. I started studying each recipe. I needed the freedom to create my recipes, and I needed a method. I spent a lot of time investigating ingredients and techniques, looking for answers to my questions. And this was the beginning of the V-Concept method, a method to create healthier, lighter, and tastier recipes from scratch. In 2015, I opened my pastry school in Viladecans, where we have taught the method to more than 1,000 students. In 2020, we opened our R&D center and created this unique online course. Now you can take this course.
We introduce you to the online extended version of the V-Concept course. In this course, composed of 4 different parts, you will learn how to formulate and create your own pastry recipes. In the first part, you will learn everything about water, fats, proteins, and carbohydrates, the molecules that make up all our ingredients. Knowing their physicochemical and functional properties will give you the knowledge that you need to work with any pastry ingredient. Through the second part, you will be able to master emulsification, aeration, thickening, and gelation, 4 techniques that are essential for creating perfectly balanced pastry textures. In the third part, you will learn how to formulate recipes using the V-Concept method. We will show you over 30 practical cases and give you the keys to create healthier, lighter, and tasty recipes. In the last part, we will show you step by step how to execute a collection of pastry creations. We will give you many practical tips so you can apply them in your daily work. The course includes more than 40 hours of videos, a theory book of over 300 pages and countless recipes. You will also be able to participate in forums and live webinars to solve all your doubts and interact with other students. You will put your knowledge to test, with different assignments and self-evaluation tests, and by completing them, you will earn your training certificate. But don't worry, we will guide you and help you all along the way.
If you love pastry and want to understand all the processes and reactions behind your recipes, this is the course you have been waiting for.
It is a perfect course for any pastry chef wanting to share their values through their creations.
Maybe you want to redesign and adapt your recipes so that they fit better your customers' needs.
Or you need to balance your recipes, resolving any stability, texture, or taste issues.
And if you are looking for a course to learn how to save time and resources, look no more.
To take the course, you only need a device with internet connection, pen, paper, and a desire to learn.
Throughout this course, we will give you all the tools that you need to become independent at creating your own pastry collection.
Master the big concept method and tap into your infinite creative potential.
You will be surprised at what you can achieve once you complete this course.
Come and join us. Now we are going to start explaining the difference between this recipe that is not well stabilized, that we have syneresis, and we are going to explain what we changed on the recipes in order to fix this problem.
Exactly, because I think like pastry chefs, they're very practical, right? They want to see, they want to touch. So here we have a perfect example to show you that we also have had this problem. We had mousses that seemed to be okay, but then after undergoing the freeze and thaw process, they showed syneresis. And Jordi will guide you step by step, like through the recipe, and then tell you how he fixed it, so that you can understand exactly how we fix syneresis problems in our recipes.
Here I'm going just to tell the recipe in percentage, and tomorrow with Marta we will send to you these two recipes and also the information that we are using today on the live. And here on the first recipe that we created with our method was 1% of gelatin. This gelatin is 200 bloom, was 1% or 10 grams if we are going to work in a recipe of 1 kilo. Then we have a raspberry puree that we have 59% of raspberry puree, that is 5,900 grams of this puree. Then we have egg whites that we are going to use for create a meringue. This will be 12%. And in this meringue, we are going to add 8% of sugar, is 120 grams of egg whites and 80 grams of sugar, 12% and 8%. And finally, we added cream in order to have the creaminess and also to introduce air inside of the recipe. Semi-whipped, we can say semi-whipped cream.
Semi-whipped cream.
Semi-whipped cream. We have 20%, 200 grams. This was the first recipe that we created, and we prepared this recipe by mixing the gelatin with the puree, with a part of puree. We let it hydrate the gelatin around 20-30 minutes, 1 hour, in order to have a perfect hydration of the gelatin. Then this we can say gelatin mass that we prepared with raspberry puree, we heat it at 45 degrees, and then we mix it with the rest of the raspberry puree
Yeah.
at 20 degrees. And we have the technique of gelation. We are using gelatin, and here we have the technique of gelation. And then for the other side, we semi-whipped the cream, and we prepared the meringue. For prepare the meringue, we just whipped the egg whites at 30 degrees during around 3 minutes. We added the sugar, it's a French meringue. We added the sugar, we whipped 6-7 minutes more, and then when we have the meringue ready for this final mixing of the recipe, we added the puree, to the meringue, and finally the cream. And we mix it, this recipe, and we have it. We freeze it and thaw this recipe in a ring, and we have it this result. And here we can see that we have some syneresis around of this texture. How much dry extract we have here? Here in that recipe, we have 27.8% of dry extract that comes for the 1% of the gelatin that we have. The 1% of gelatin is everything is dry extract. Then in the puree, in the 59% of puree inside, we have dry extract. And in this case, in this puree, we are using a puree without sugar, without added sugar. Then we have this puree is going to give us dry extract. Egg whites is going to give us dry extract because in egg whites we have protein that is almost 11% of protein, 11% of protein, and we have 12% of dry extract in the egg whites. That means that this 12% it transforms in 1.44% of dry extract that give us to the recipe this egg whites. Then we have sugar, 8% of dry extract, and then finally we have cream, this 20% that will transform more or less in 8% more or less. We are going to calculate in order to explain on the right way. We have 20.
I think it's a useful exercise because I was just checking there's some questions that you are asking us, right? And also, like, just to remind you, like, you can send us your questions now. Like, after the explanation, we will take our time to answer your question and solve your doubts. So one of the questions was, how do you get the dry extract percent? So with the example of the cream, Jordi can show you. If we have 20%,
we have 20%, and we're going to work in a rule of 3. That means that 20% in 100% of cream, we are going to say that we have 40%. It depends the kind of cream that we are using. We can have 40, 42%. Yeah. This we have to check the technical file. Okay, that means that here in that recipe we have 20% that we are going to divide between 100. Is like that we have to explain, Adrianna, 100, and then we are going to multiply per 40% that we have. 40% of dry extract.
Exactly.
That means that this 20% of whipped cream is going to give us 8% of dry extract in that recipe. In total, we have more or less 27.8% of dry extract in that recipe. What happened here? We are using 2 techniques. We are using gelation through the gelatin, and we are using aeration through the cream, and also through the meringue that we are using on the recipe. And we don't have enough stability. We need to add or more dry extract, or the solution here was to add another technique. And we added thickening, the thickening technique by working with a thickening agent like locust bean gum. And this was the really easy solution in order to avoid this problem. And on the new recipe, we have 1% of gelatin, and we keep the 1% of the gelatin because the texture was the texture that we created that we needed, that was perfectly fixed. Then in raspberry puree, we have 58.20% of puree, and we have locust bean gum. Adrianna,
yes, locust bean gum,
because I have in Spanish. This is so completely. Locust bean gum, we have 0.8%. Locust bean gum we can use in a recipe between 0.2 until 1%, more or less. It depends the kind of the recipe that we are using. We can use until 1%, and here we are using just 0.8% in order to trap all this water that we have and to avoid this problem that we have on the freezing and thaw process. And then we have egg whites, 12%, exactly the same, and we have sugar 8% and 20% of cream, exactly the same. The difference between the recipes on the dry extract is almost
nothing. It really shows
nothing.
You that it's not just the dry extract, but the whole concept, right? Dry extract, its water catching capacity, and the number of techniques.
And what was here on the recipe, we have 28.64% of dry extract, and here the solution is that we are using 3 techniques. This thickening technique through this locust bean gum is helping us in order to control this water that we have. This is one way to implement a solution. To add another technique, we add this technique, this gives us more control of the water, and almost with the same dry extract, we have a perfect control of the water on the freezing and thaw process. Then another solution will be to increase dry extract on the recipe, and this can be just adding more sugar to the recipe. Here in that recipe, we have 8%, but we can add, for example, 5% more of sugar on the recipe. This for sure is going to give us sweetness on the recipe, but we will increase in 5% the percentage of dry extract that we have at the end of this formulation. No? That means that here we have 28.6 of dry extract, and we can arrive more or less to 33% of dry extract. This will give us more stability on the recipe. But what we are going to remove in order to add more sugar to the recipe? I will remove, for example, raspberry puree. I'm going to remove 5% of raspberry puree. I'm going to add 5% more sugar on the recipe, and this is going to give us this stability, adding more dry extract on the recipe. The same thing will be, for example, if we do exactly the same, but instead of add sugar, 5% of sugar, we can add, for example, 5% of inulin on your recipe. And this inulin has a high water catchment capacity, and just working with this 5%, we will have absolutely different results. We will have much more control of the water that we have in our recipe. Also because inulin is a thickening agent.
Exactly.
Okay, like that we can see like two solutions that we can implement. The three solutions that we can implement in our recipe that we have this problem, that we can introduce more dry extract, we can increase the water catchment capacity of this dry extract that we are using on the recipe, or we can increase in techniques in order to stabilize better the water that we have inside of the texture.
And I think it's a good example, Jordi, of just like explaining what do we do when we have a recipe and we don't understand like why it has syneresis. Now that the first thing would be basically to work with pen and paper and just like not just looking at it, not to repeat, wishing for a different result, because it might not get us anywhere. And then but just by analyzing recipes, what happens is we get the number of dry extract and we think like, oh, maybe it's 25 or 20. Then obviously we need to have a little bit more of dry extract, or maybe it's just or maybe it's, as Jordi said, over 30, like 31, but still it doesn't work. So maybe we need to add another technique. But this work of analyzing your own recipes or the recipes that you are working with, and to like really find out why they don't work and how to fix them, I think it's one of the most valuable tasks that you can do, right? Like as a pastry chef, to really understand not just like first of all, why it didn't work and how to fix it, right? Like taking these numbers and working with them, going back to the 3 circles that we showed you, and just like trying to find out. Because another example that maybe I wanted to bring to your attention is something that a pastry chef from Poland actually wrote us, a couple of weeks ago, and it was a very good example to also show us that sometimes our recipe works in one context, and then we switch the context, and it happened also to Jordi, right? Yes. Like traveling and the recipe doesn't work, and then and gives us syneresis, right? And sometimes we don't understand why. So another thing would be like if it's not the numbers, if it's not like the analysis doesn't get us anywhere, we need to also focus on the ingredients, because the question we got was about a cheesecake that would work in one cultural context, and then by switching to another cheese, a cream cheese from a different country and from a different producer, like it gives syneresis problems, right? We have to be conscious that even such simple ingredients like whipped cream or cream cheese or egg yolks or egg whites. We had pastry chefs contacting us about the composition of egg whites, because they said like, oh, in Norway, it's impossible to get egg whites without this stabilizer and this thickener and this right? So from country to country, sometimes we have difference as far as ingredients go. And so cream cheese that we use, or cream cheese that is widely available, I think both in Europe and in Spain, they can have already the stabilizing agents, the thickening agents, right, incorporated, like guar gum or locust bean gum or xanthan gum or carrageenans. So if we don't know about it, then we switch to another product that might be a fresh product, right? We might buy fresh cream cheese, or we might buy another, right, like, or whipped cream without the stabilizer or without the thickener. And then the recipe stops working, and we have this water leaking out of the recipe, and we don't know why. So I think it's also something to take in mind, to keep in mind, that sometimes we need to know very well our ingredients, and we need to know we need to have the technical data sheets for our ingredients, right? Maybe Jordi, you also an example comes to your mind.
This example is perfect in order to understand that you always are working on the same direction with the same ingredients. No, I remember when I was in Bangkok doing the class in Bangkok, and we were working with egg whites that contain xanthan gum inside, and I did not have this information, and when we started to work, and I remember when I mixed the first mousse that I did in this class, and was exactly the same recipe that I'm doing everywhere, and I saw like the texture was really thick, really fast, no? And was because on the recipe we were working with locust bean gum, but here in our school we were working with egg whites without xanthan gum, and we had the problem not to add the synergia.
Yes, actually the synergy between locust bean gum and xanthan gum, which become very powerful together and almost create a gel.
And was just to mix the meringue with the emulsification that we have, and in general was really liquid and was really easy to work. And in that moment was like a really thick texture, and I was thinking, what happened? Why we have this problem here? And in general, I don't have this problem. And the first thing that I did was to check the egg whites, because we were working with the same chocolate that we use in our school, and we were working with the same ingredients, but was only sorry that we have here. We checked the egg white that we were using in Bangkok, and I saw on the technical file xanthan gum and other stabilizers, and this give me this different texture on the mixing process. And this, in that moment, then the texture when we freeze and thaw this texture was really gummy texture, because over
gelled or even over thickened, over gelled, right? It's really very interesting, because as you said, Jordi, sometimes also like pastry chefs send us recipes saying, but this recipe worked and then it stopped working, right? And then we look for a reason. So sometimes the reason is just switching your, let's say, egg whites provider, right? Like you can switch from one brand to another brand, not knowing that the composition of your ingredient has changed, and the amount of thickening agents or stabilizers, that even though it's a very small percentage, it can be really, with xanthan gum it can be 0.05%, but it changes completely the texture and the outcome. It can change for the better, or it can change for the worse. So we have to be very mindful about that.
That means that when we have this kind of problems, because we change an ingredient, we have to check the technical file in order to have the right information, and to be sure that we are using exactly the same ingredient with the same, for example, percentage of fat, the same percentage of proteins inside, the same added ingredients, like for example stabilizers that we can have on the cream or on the cream cheese. Know that we have some companies that they add this kind of ingredients in order to have more stability, and to avoid, for example, Syneresis on the products. And then we can find ingredients like, for example, cream that doesn't contain any kind of stabilizer, and this is going to transform in our recipe in different result at the end.
Exactly. And I think this here we can make a point, because I saw that also we had a question referring exactly to this, like where do we get this information, right, about our ingredient? Well, usually, for example, the question was about the puree, right? How do we know the percentage of water, or how do we know the percentage of dry extract? It's true that, like, for example, if we make puree ourselves using fresh strawberries, it might be a little difficult to know all this percentage of fiber or sugars or protein is probably nothing, but it's really hard to get the percentages. But if we're working with commercial products like brands, right, puree brands, normally they should deliver the product together with a technical file where you should have the nutritional composition of this ingredient. So you should always ask your manufacturer or your produce guy or whoever like delivers the food. Obviously, in case of fresh food and vegetable, they usually don't have laboratory available to really test it. So you can sometimes go on Wikipedia and search for it. But the problem is that from one year to another, from the amount of sunshine, rain, the area where your, let's say, strawberries grew, right? You can have strawberries from Spain, you can have strawberries from Poland, and maybe they will be different in the composition of sugars because they got a different amount of sun. So,
can change a little bit, but in general,
yes, but it will not change like from having
20
80%,
60%,
exactly,
yes.
exactly. Neither the amount of sugar nor the amount of water will change drastically. There will be variations, maybe 5% it can change, but not 20 nor 14 or 50. And
then also, Adrianna, we have books that we can buy, books that we have only nutritional information of all classic ingredients that we can use on cooking or in pastry. And in this kind of books we can find all this information. And just adding, because this dry extract we explain in pastry and we use in pastry, we explain so much in our course, but in general in pastry we don't use this concept, no? And the dry extract is just the addition of these proteins, carbohydrates, and fats that we have in all these products, and like that we can calculate the percentage of dry extract that we are doing in our recipes in order to know if we have enough or we have to add more dry extract in our recipe.
Exactly, and also we might give you a tip if you know. There's also a website that sometimes we use because it has a lot of, especially if you're from the US and you buy products or brands that are available there. There is you can type Food Data Central, and then it's a website by the Ministry of Agriculture, I think. So it's an official website where a lot of brands have registered their products, and you can actually, let's say, type this puree of this brand, and you will have the nutritional composition of this certain brand and a certain product. So this is another advice for if you need to find the data and you don't know where to look for.
I think that we can start
with the questions.
Adrianna,
yes,
do you have something more to explain?
No, we hope that that's all clear, including the way to calculate. Right? If you have some problems with this, we can still use the easy flip and and give you a short revision of the rule of 3. But I think if you have any questions about the content that we just presented, like now it's the good time to send your questions, and we will go through them one by one.
Here we have a question of Monica. In high water content fruits inserts such as raspberry or strawberry, it's better to use inulin because of the addition of fibers. Inulin is one solution, but also there is another solutions. The first thing that we need is to have this more or less 30% of dry extract. This 30% of dry extract in this kind of texture can comes from the sugars that we have. Also on the fruits that we are using that contains fruits and fiber, all this is dry extract, and also the sugar that we are going to add on the recipe in order to have sweetness on this recipe. That means that we will need around 50% of dry extract in order to have a perfect balance between water and dry extract on the recipe. But if we are going to have too much sweetness on the recipe because we need to add too much sugar in order to have this 30% of dry extract, here we can use inulin in order to avoid to add too much sugar and avoid to have a really high sweetness sensation. And that means the inulin usability or usability.
The use of the purpose of using inulin.
Thank you, Adrianna. The purpose.
Yes, the purpose of using inulin in this case, the objective, right?
Can help us in order to reduce sweetness. Like that, we will have the minimum of dry extract that we need on the recipe, but we will have less sweetness on the final result of this recipe, and this will give us stability. But then also we have to think in what kind of jelly agents we are using. For example, for compotes and jelly textures, gelatin is really bad ingredient in order to set. I don't like too much because it doesn't work so well. It's like, for example, cornstarch, when we freeze, it freezes. Not exactly on the same direction, but it's quite similar. No? And this is because gelatin, when we have like a block of texture, I mean, a block of texture is when we don't have air inside of a texture, no? Like, for example, compote, jellies, or creamy texture. Gelatin doesn't work so well. There is better ingredients that can help us to have a perfect gelation, like, for example, pectins. And these ingredients has much more water catchment capacity and much more water control in our recipe. That means that in a recipe that we are using gelatin as a jelly agent in a gelation technique, if we change for pectin, we will have much more better results than working with gelatin. That means, in order to close the question, is that it's not just working within inulin that we will have a better result. Is the balance between the dry extract that we have on the recipe, the water catchment capacity that we are using, and the techniques that we are using. No, that means that, and the ingredients of the techniques. No, that means that gelatin for compotes and jellies is not so good like a jelly agent. Pectin is much better. And another solution can be to add, for example, a thickening agent. If for any reason we want to work with gelatin, and sorry, Jordi, but we can work only with gelatin in that recipe, that means that the solution can be to add, for example, a locust bean gum, a thickening technique in that recipe, and like that, try to control this water by using the gelatin that will be not the perfect ingredient for our gelation technique, but working in team with this locust bean gum and this new technique that will be thickening, we will have a perfect balance on the recipe. All these points is the points that we have to control in this kind of fruit inserts that we use in modern pastry.
Exactly. I see a question, Jordi, that I would like to tackle if you let me. Vanessa asked us, what are the difference in mousse texture of using xanthan, guar, locust bean, and other hydrocolloids? It's a very valid question, because sometimes we think, okay, there's so many of these gums, so many of the hydrocolloids, right? Sometimes we even say maybe we need to explain, because the word hydrocolloids seems a little technical. Hydrocolloids are basically the ingredients which have a lot of affinity for water. They have the capacity to interact with water in colloidal suspension, suspensions, but they are basically proteins or polysaccharides, right? And in the world of polysaccharides, we have fibers and we have starches, and then we have inside gums are actually, they belong to the category, they are fibers, they are polysaccharides, right? And we have xanthan gum, guar gum, tara gum, we have locust bean gum, then we have Arabic gum, and we are like, okay, but which one do I use, right? So each of them has very specific physical-chemical properties, and each of them has a very specific water catching capacity. So if we want to have a mousse texture, right, and we use the same concentration of xanthan, guar, and locust bean gum, we will end up with 3 completely different textures, right? And so it's important maybe to do a little bit of research and first know what is the water catching capacity, or what is the comparative between the locust bean gum, xanthan gum, and guar gum. Guar is the closest to xanthan. Xanthan is the most powerful gum as far as like one of the most powerful hydrocolloids as far as water catching capacity is concerned, which means that we can use just with 0.05% of xanthan gum, we can really start thickening our recipes. I'm not saying that every time you will only need 0.05, but sometimes 0.1 of xanthan is really enough. And in some recipes where we need a lot of control of free water, 0.2 is more than enough. We rarely reach 0.3, 0.4, 0.5 of xanthan gum in our mousses or in our recipes, because we would end up
0.3 is the limit.
Exactly.
0.3.
Exactly, because it has an incredible water catching capacity. And if we compare the xanthan gum with guar gum or locust bean gum, it changes. Guar gum is, let's say, the closest to xanthan gum. It's among the gums that are that form this group, like locust bean gum and guar gum and tara gum are actually like belong to the group of galactomannans. So within this group, guar gum is the most powerful thickening agent. It has the most water catching capacity. And if we compare guar with locust bean gum, guar has 4 times water catching capacity of the locust bean gum. So it's not the same if I put 0.1 of locust bean gum and if I put 0.1 of guar. For example, going back to your recipe, Jordi, if here in the same recipe for the raspberry mousse, instead of putting locust bean gum, if we put in this mousse 0.8 of guar gum, it wouldn't be
thick.
Yes, I don't think we could eat it and enjoy it a lot because it's too much. 0.8 of guar gum would be like 0.5 of xanthan gum. It would give us such a thick texture that either we could have some problems mixing the puree,
recipe.
exactly, mixing the recipe and making the mousse, or we would have like a less, we would have not a very pleasurable texture during the degustation. So
in this way, Adrianna, one thing that helped me to understand the difference between the gums was the exercise that we did with the recipe, exactly the same recipe of compote, was a strawberry compote, and we did the same recipe with pectin, but in each recipe with different gums. I think that we tested like 4 or 5 different gums, and like that you really understand the difference between one gum and to the other gum. And was really interesting because I was using, for example, on the recipes in general, locust bean gum, because it's really easy to find locust bean gum. But when I tasted the recipe that was with guar gum, was really creamy, and I was thinking, wow, this gum is completely different than locust bean gum. In locust bean gum, we have control of water, but don't have this.
The mouthfeel changes, right?
For sure.
It's for each gum can have their different mouthfeel, and just like the water, it's also a little bit related to its water catching capacity, because the more viscosity we have, maybe the more creaminess we have, right? There's a reason why xanthan gum or guar gum are mostly used to increase also not just for their water catching capacity, but also when we look for additional creaminess in or creamy mouthfeel in water-based recipes. So just to wrap up the answer to this question, like, of course, there would be differences if I were to classify to you as far as the water catching capacity of these 3 gums that you mentioned, Vanessa, is concerned. Well, first, it would be xanthan gum, for sure, the highest water catching capacity, the highest, let's say, thickening capacity. Then not far behind guar gum, and then we would go actually towards tara gum, and then we would finish with like locust bean gum and some other gums. So if you, for example, if you're making some recipes and you don't have this gum and you want to switch one gum for another, you also have to be mindful about that, because if you don't have xanthan gum but you have locust bean gum, it's not, you shouldn't use the same percentage. You
have to adjust.
Exactly.
We need to understand each gum, how it works on the recipe, and to adjust.
Exactly.
Here we have another question, another question from Edgar. How could you make a pro-vegan cream for a freezable tiramisu? Okay, just how to create, how it will work. No, I think how we can create a recipe of tiramisu.
Yes, I like it because it's a challenge. Yes, vegan tiramisu, so no mascarpone. I understand.
For sure.
Exactly. Well, some time ago we played with vegan Bailey's cream, right?
Yes.
Right, Bailey's creamy, and so first thing that comes to my mind is like we would need to look for some plant-based milk or cheese. Exactly, plant-based cheese that could be cashew or almond or a mix. It could be even like if it's too hard, right? Maybe we have to also dilute it or with water or maybe with working with some plant-based milk or right.
In a classic recipe, if we understand the classic recipe, we can say that we have a dated product that is cream cheese. The other day with the Elvir demonstration, we did this most, and we have cream cheese, and cream cheese contains the product for sure is not vegan, but I'm going just to explain in order to keep in mind what we need. No, and this product brings us the fat that we need on the recipe, bring us the water that we need on the recipe in order to have a balance, give us the emulsification capacity, and that means that using cream cheese, a standard cream cheese, no, like the Elvir that we used on that recipe, was on the same product. We have the emulsification capacity. Then what we added in that recipe was egg yolks, just 5% in order to have, because when you have in mind tiramisu, no, exactly. you have egg taste inside of the recipe. That means that I added 5% of egg whites egg yolks on the recipe in order to have this taste, and like that with mascarpone and egg yolks, we have the tiramisu taste on the recipe, and then we added just water in order to have a perfect emulsion, gelatin in order to set, and then on the aeration we worked with meringue with coconut sugar. In this case was egg whites and coconut sugar, and like that we have a perfect tiramisu mousse, for sure not vegan. If we want to replace this, we have to replace the ingredients.
Exactly, and the role in the recipe, right? Because I started writing when you were talking, Jordi, because I think it's really fascinating that even when we want to make a vegan recipe, first we go to the classic one to really understand. Yes, if we want to recreate, if we want to have a similar mouthfeel, similar texture, similar sensation, we cannot only concentrate on the coffee flavor or any flavor. We need to really try to replicate the texture. So if you were talking about what gives us egg yolks or mascarpone, in the end, taste, but also creaminess, the creamy mouthfeel. So it will be crucial for your pro-vegan tiramisu.
In vegan version, we can use, for example, the cashew cheese that we have. For example, we have a company in Barcelona, the Living Food, that is a small producer of vegan cheese.
Exactly, and it's super creamy, so you have to...
It's amazing, and for example, with this kind of vegan cheese, we can create an emulsification, and this will give us the dry extract on the recipe, the mouthfeel, the creaminess on the recipe.
Emulsion, everything,
the emulsion capacity we will need to add, because
an emulsifier.
We will need to add an emulsifier. That means that we are going to transform the mascarpone cheese in cashew, for example, or almond cheese, and here in this vegan cheese we will have water and nuts inside, and sometimes we can have fat, but in general we have this ingredient, and sometimes lemon juice inside. That means that we are going to transform this mascarpone in this vegan cheese. Then we will need emulsion capacity, and we are going to use one emulsifier. We can use, for example, fibers, citrus fibers that we use in a lot of recipes, because has a really good emulsion capacity. Or if we don't have citrus fibers, we can use just lecithin. That lecithin is going to help us to bring together this water, or for example, cashew milk that we can use in that recipe. We will create a perfect emulsification, and then we go to the jelly
Gelation, exactly, because you
Gelation.
mentioned gelatin. We have to think, okay, with what do we replace this this important technique?
And in that direction, we can work, for example, with pectin can be one interesting option. For example, we work with a pectin that called acid-free from Sosa company that give us the capacity to set liquids, for example, that don't have any kind of acidic
pH, yes, that are more
neutral.
Yes, or going in the direction of neutral pH, right? Because usually the nuts will have a pH around 5. It can,
we have
right?
Like
so
acidic, but
exactly
almost neutral.
So we cannot work with pectin NH. We have to look for pectins that were modified, right, in order to work with this higher pH.
That means that with this pectin, we will have we will transform the gelatin that we have on the classic recipe for this jelly agent that is a vegan jelly agent, because pectin is a fiber. And also, if we don't have this pectin, you can work with agar-agar. But if you work with agar-agar, you will need to work with a thickening agent, with a thickening ingredient in team. That means that in order to control syneresis. No? That means that we have the first option to use pectin acid-free, or to use, for example, agar-agar and one thickening agent, like, for example, xanthan gum on the recipe. And like that, we are going to replicate
yes,
the gelatin function on the recipe. And then what more we will need? We will need aeration. We need to add air to the recipe. And in this recipe that we created this recipe with egg whites. We can transform these egg whites, for example, with aquafaba. Is really simple to use, and the result is really perfect. And we can transform these egg whites in aquafaba and work just with a sugar on the recipe. And like that, with all these ingredients, we will have like a perfect vegan tiramisu. But we need to replicate the taste. For me, I think the more difficult is to try to find the same taste that we have in tiramisu of the mascarpone, because always when we are working with, sorry for the expression, but we are working with the animal products, animal products from the animal production, we have this taste that is really high taste that when we are used to work and used to eat this kind, we are used to taste this kind of products. We always find the other products that are really poor in intensity, and we need to just try to find the way to add this flavor that we need by adding, for example, I don't know, but vanilla can help us to add this flavor interesting. Maybe add coffee to the mousse, but try to find the ingredients that will help us to have a perfect structure, but also a perfect taste of tiramisu. But it's not easy to find exactly the same taste, because we have a tiramisu in mind, and tiramisu has mascarpone and egg yolks. And this is really, really difficult to replicate in vegan. But we can say vegan version, no?
The next question, just to give you a short breather, Jordi. How can I guide myself? It's from Joyce. How can I guide myself when it comes to the proper amount of inulin to use in a recipe? Is there a limit? Well, first of all, I'm sure that many people who connected today, maybe it's the first time you hear of inulin, right? And maybe you don't know what kind of fiber or what kind of ingredient it is. It's actually fiber from chicory root. But if you want to know more, we can invite you to our blog where we made a live explaining inulin, where we have articles about working with inulin, so you can get the basics of working with inulin on our blog. And just to answer your question right now, yes, there is a limit of using inulin. If we're working with native inulin, the ones that we most typically use, right, as Jordi said, it gives us some water catching capacity, some important water catching capacity. But if we use too much, let's say if we use 20-30% of inulin in a recipe, we can end up with a very dry texture, with something that is not the mouthfeel that we were looking for. Also, just a point to mention,
for the body.
Exactly, for the body, inulin is a fiber, and as such, also it belongs to the group of ingredients that are, let's say, sometimes people with digestive problems, right, can have some issues after eating too much of inulin, or after
fibers
eating
in general.
exactly fibers in general, right? So especially people with, let's say, irritable bowel syndrome, or like some dysbiosis in the bowels, like they should actually avoid eating too much fiber or eating inulin. But for people with healthy digestive system, normally we try not to exceed like some guidelines that would say 20 grams of inulin per 100-gram portion of a cake. So this is our, let's say, our limit that we never never exceed.
The maximum that we have, Adrianna, is in our raspberry pearl. This
Exactly.
product that is red is like with raspberries, and we have on the middle we have a raspberry creamy and really shiny. And here in that product we have 16%
Exactly.
by using inulin
and oligofructose, which is from the same family group.
In total, 16%. That is the maximum that we use it. But normally on the recipes we have between 5 to 10%.
Yes, 15 is like really a lot. So so this would be your guideline, and you can look for more tips on how to work with inulin, and also some recipes that we have on our blog.
Here, Adrianna, there is a question really interesting also. Wendy, can you explain more about how aeration helps to prevent syneresis?
Yeah, yes, but I only know the explanation because you helped me actually understand it. Like when we have a very compact, right, a very compact structure actually, right, and when we freeze it and we defrost it, like what happens? It's compact, but it has water inside, right? So the ice crystals that are formed, like, are actually you can even think of a fruit, right, or that you're freezing, like of these strawberries, or strawberries are quite juicy, right? So like when you have fibers, but it's not such a compact structure as, let's say, with sweet potato. Because from my personal experience, I've been freezing sweet potatoes with a horrible end result. So I learned that this is something that should be avoided. Why? Because if you have this like compact structure with, let's say, fibers and water trapped inside, and then the ice crystals will really rupture the cell walls, those fibers, right? And like you will end up with a texture that is really not pleasant, that it doesn't have the same texture as before. On the other hand, if you have a texture that is, let's say, that has more air, right, that has where the three-dimensional network, right, like that the water is entrapped, is that also includes air bubbles, then even the water that there is there, like,
can expand.
Exactly, has some space to expand because of the air bubbles. So it will not be as aggressive, or the effect will not be as detrimental as in the case of a gel or a creamy, where you have a really compact three-dimensional gel. So the difference is you have also air, you have more space, the ice crystals have a little bit where to move, and they don't rupture the network in such a profound, let's say, or such a way as in the case of a different structure.
Also, it depends what kind of aeration we add to the recipe, Adrianna. If, for example, we work with whipping cream, we are going to add dry extract on the recipe, and it means that this is going to help us to the stability. If we work, for example, with a meringues, on the meringues, we are using carbohydrates, and carbohydrates has the capacity to catch the water. No? That means that, for example, in a French meringue, we are using sugar, and this sugar will help us to catch all this water that we have at the beginning on the meringue, but also at the end of the recipe. And it's exactly the same if, for example, we use inulin or oligofructose in our meringue. This fiber is going also to help us to catch all this water that we have on the recipe. That means that aeration helps, but we have to think in many different directions. No, it's not like emulsification that is really simple, because through the emulsification, what we do is to bring the water and fat that we have on the recipe together, and this gives us like a kind of of consistency and give us more stability on the recipe. On the aeration, it's a little bit more complex, the facts that we have to keep in mind in order to understand that this helps us to prevent syneresis.
Exactly. Next
question, Irmak. I have a tiramisu recipe. Its stability is not consistency. Should I decrease the coffee syrup amount? This is what I use on the recipe. We have the recipe, but we need the recipe in % in order to understand this. If you just can
recalculate. For example, 8 egg yolks, right? Egg yolk, a typical egg yolk would be 20 grams, and so then you know that you have, let's say, 160 grams, and then all the other ingredients, sum all of them, right? And
as well, I'm not familiar with the cups. No,
yes, it's one and a half of cup of cream or 1.5 cup of sugar.
Regarding the recipe and see more or less the percentage that can be these different ingredients. One problem can be that you are not working on the right direction on the emulsification. I think that you are using egg yolks and mascarpone. These are the 2 ingredients that you need to emulsify, and for example, cream also. Sorry, egg yolks, cream, and mascarpone. And you need to bring all of them minimum 35, 36 degrees, and to emulsify during minimum, let me check. No, because cream will be whipped cream, I think.
Okay.
Will be whipped cream. Just egg yolks and mascarpone cheese with the coffee syrup and the sugar and the gelatin already hydrated all together at 35 degrees and to emulsify perfectly with a hand blender. During 1 minute, all these ingredients at 35, 36 degrees. And why this temperature? Because at this temperature, we have all the fatty acids inside of all these ingredients that we have completely melted, and the emulsifiers can bring together all the water and fat that we have inside. And this process needs to be around 1 minute. And once you have this perfect emulsion, 35 degrees, you add the cream at around 10, 12 degrees, the whipped cream, I think that you have on the recipe. You just add it, and I think that the recipe will be much more stable on the freezing process. And then if you want to improve the result, you just need to add a thickening
agent, because I also looking at this thinking if this mascarpone doesn't have any stabilizing or thickening agent, right? Egg yolks are not very stable on the freeze and thaw process. Neither is gelatin. Mascarpone, well, depending on whether it has any thickening or stabilizing agents, but in general, looking at the recipe without the amounts, we think that maybe you need some stabilizer in the form of just a small percentage. Let's say it could be 0.2 of oxanthan gum or of locust bean gum or guar gum, and you can try if it helps.
Here in that recipe can be really interesting, Irmak, to instead to work with cream, for example, to use meringue. Because if we use meringue, we will have a lighter recipe, and it's much more interesting. That means that instead to mix whipping cream, prepare a meringue, a French meringue, with the sugar that you have on the recipe and egg whites, and mix it on the recipe, and you will see that your recipe will be much
more stable, and lighter. And
that is really interesting on the tiramisu, because in tiramisu we have a lot of fat that comes from the mascarpone, and then if we add egg yolks and we add cream, we transform the recipe in something really fatty.
Another question about inulin, right? Can I use inulin working with pralines and bonbons? Yes, you can, but you have to be very mindful of the fact that, like, how in the chocolate bonbons, you don't have that much water, right? You have some, because if you're putting some ganache inside, you can have a certain amount of water, but it's little. So with little inulin that you put, you might actually end up having a very dry texture. There are chocolates made with inulin, although it's actually more into, it would be more into the direction of oligofructose, which is
Oligofructose.
much more similar than
we mean
exactly
bean to bar, eh?
exactly bean to bar chocolates that are made
with in order to reduce or to
the amount of
avoid
sugar.
or to
Exactly.
avoid the sugar that we have inside. We can use oligofructose, and the oligofructose is a fiber that has much better functions on the body than sugar, for sure. And we can use oligofructose, but give us sweetness on the chocolate, and like that we can remove, we can completely remove the sugar on the bean to bar chocolate. We have another questions. Can we use? Perfect. Vanessa, apart from gums, if we add glucose syrup into a mousse recipe, does it help to control water as well? For sure, glucose is going to help us because water has much more water catchment capacity than sugar, but it's not like fiber. I think that for me, sugar and glucose are really poor. They have really poor water catchment capacity, and then we have the fibers that has incredible water catchment capacity, like for example inulin.
Although, if I may just add, Jordi, my question would be, but what the DE of your glucose syrup?
For sure.
Because as Jordi said, right, like a glucose syrup, let's say DE 74, right, or even DE 90, has very little water catching capacity. But then if we go and look for the glucose syrup DE 20 or DE 34, it's more, it's very different. It has different properties, and it increases. While the number of DE decreases, the water catching capacity of glucose or glucose syrups increases. So you need to also ask what type of glucose syrup is it, right? Or what type of glucose?
Anna Paula asked, what is the chemical function of air in the syneresis or avoiding it?
I'm not sure. Yes, I think we answered like how the air adds, right, like the ice crystals, like to have a space where to expand. I'm not sure if I have any other.
If you're thinking that in big, imagine this picture of a mousse, but the texture in a big picture, you have bubbles of air inside of this mousse, and you have the ingredients that you added on the recipe in order to have this structure. When you have a bubble of air, this water that we have here is going to expand, has a space in order to expand. And in this kind of textures, this will be less aggressive than, for example, when we have a compote or creamy, that we have a block of ingredients with water, with sugars, with fibers, with proteins, and the water is going to expand, but breaking directly all we created. This is the huge difference between a mousse and compote or creamy texture. And it's for that reason that, for example, in mousses, we can use gelatin, and in general, the recipe will be perfectly stable. But then when we start to use gelatin in creamy and compote textures, in general, we have much more problems of stability of our texture. And this is one of the reasons.
We have the question about blast freezing, right? If you blast freeze your mousse product and then move it to a freezer with -18, will it change it in texture to worse? Well, actually, no, it's something we all need to do because no one keeps all their pastries, right, in a blast freezer. It will be way too expensive, like just to use the blast freezer for conservation. So what we do as well is like we bring the mousse down to -30 or -40, right, to give it a very good like stability, let's say, and to freeze it quickly.
Even Adrianna, -20. The most important thing is to bring really fast. Between 2 degrees until -8. But when we have the mousse that is hard, that we can manipulate.
We keep it in the normal freezer. Although one thing to keep in mind is that if we have a freezer really full of pastries, usually it might not be -18, it might be -15, and then if we, for example, if we kept our mousse in a mold, right, like we might have more problems when we try to take it out of the mold. So then sometimes what we do is we put it back in the blast freezer for a couple of minutes or for half an hour, so that later the removal from the mold is easier. But as far as texture goes, like if we just like for storage move it to the normal freezer, there's not a problem.
I have a question from Pek Guy. You mentioned before that you bring egg whites at 30 degrees for a meringue. How we can do this? In general, we can use bain-marie is one option, but we think that there is something faster and that is really cheap to buy. That is this heating gun. I think that
you had it very you knew that this question.
we use every day. We are using this heating gun. The cost is 20 or 30 euros, and we can just buy using on the bowl, heating the bowl directly, not the whites. We can just bring at 30 degrees, and like that, we are going to have a better result on the meringue. Okay. Next question, Christina. How to prevent syneresis in bonbons and shell cracking when filling it with jams and gel with pectin? It's exactly the same that we explained it, but you have to keep in mind that in general, when we're going to work with chocolate bonbons, the shelf life is really important. That means that we cannot use, for example, the same compote that we are using in an entremets that we are going to freeze and defreeze. This compote we cannot use in bonbons, sino es que son productos de un día. ¿Cómo sería esto?
They are like one-day products.
One-day products. That means that you are going to prepare your shell of chocolate, you are going to pipe this, you are going to close, and you are going to consume in 1 or 2 days. If we want to stabilize a compote or jelly for a long shelf life for a bonbon, we have to use, like, for example, pata fruit recipes, like contains a lot of sugar inside, and this sugar is going to give us stability, shelf-life on the product, and is going to remove water on the recipe. That means on the cooking process of a pata fruit, what we are doing is to remove the water and have more and more dry extract inside of the recipe, together with the fact that we are adding a lot of sugar on the recipe, and the sugar is going to help us to prevent. We will have a texture that can be like, for example, 2 months in a chocolate bonbon. If we want to work in, I think that we will work in that direction. That means that in a chocolate bonbon, we cannot work on the same recipes that we are working, for example, in an entremets or petit gâteau, that we are going to freeze the freeze and then keep on a chiller at 3 degrees during 3 days, and then we are going to consume. It's completely different way to stabilize the recipes.
The next question from Aldrin.
For you,
I like this question. Although I didn't have the telepathic ability, Jordi, to predict this question, because if I would have asked Maria for the very beautiful picture that we have in our online course, the graphic, to explain it. But I will try to do my best with my hands. So actually, dextrose equivalent is something. This is what the DE stands for. We have glucose syrups or glucose in powder with different numbers of DE. The DE can go, let's say, from 20, or like, I think there are even the numbers that are less are not so much used, from until 100. So what is glucose syrup or glucose or glucose in powder DE 100? It's basically, it means dextrose equivalent 100. And dextrose in this case equals glucose. So it's like it's pure dextrose, it's pure glucose, right? These are molecules, these are just those units of glucose. And what is glucose syrup or glucose in powder? DE 20, right? So actually, how do we make glucose? Glucose is the product of degradation of starch. So first we take starch, okay? Imagine you have what is starch? Starch is composed of 2 molecules, amylose and amylopectin, but both of them are very long chains. They can be like, let's say, linear, or they can have some ramifications, but they are long chains of glucose molecules. These are like glucose units linked together, but they can be really long chains. So first you have starch, and then you're like cutting it. It's the degradation of starch that gives you different products, different glucose syrups. So if you cut it just a little bit, you can imagine that you have like still chains of glucose that maybe are not as long, but are still long pieces of those chains. And this would be, so the degradation of starch, right, is only a little. So the number of DE, dextrose equivalent, is small. It would be like DE5, DE15, DE20, okay? When we haven't done a lot of these cuts. The more you cut, the higher the number, until you reach pure glucose, right? So the more of the degradation of starch you have, the sweeter the product and the less of water catching capacity it has, right? If it's only a little bit of the degradation, you still have high water catching capacity, because starch has high water catching capacity, but you have very little sweetness. In glucose syrup, DE20, you don't have a lot of sweetness. And in contrast, if you use glucose syrup 70, DE74, you have a lot of sweetness, but very little water catching capacity. I hope it was clear enough, Jordi, even without the image. But
Angelica, when you talk about fibers, what examples could you please give us? Let's say the fibers from fruits. We have fibers in fruits. We have fibers in nuts. In nuts, we have between, I think, 9 to 14%. In some nuts, we can have fibers. Then we have fibers in cacao. We have fibers. And then we can use different kinds of fibers that we can find on the market. We use a lot inulin fiber in our recipes to add fiber and control dry extract and balance the sweetness in our recipes. But then we have a lot of fibers, like, for example, the
pea.
From
sweet
pea
pea,
and
from sweet pea.
from sweet pea, from different products that we can buy just the fiber of these products. That means that you can not only find on the natural ingredients, if not, you can buy fiber, pure fiber, in order to add in your recipes. Then we have a question from Tak. Have you ever worked with xylitol or erythritol? If not, why? We did some tests. I don't like too much erythritol. Xylitol, I can say that
we have a certain dislike for aftertaste. So we have actually tested erythritol, xylitol, and stevia. And we find all of them to give us this aftertaste, right? In the case of xylitol or erythritol, is this refreshing, a little mint-like aftertaste. In the case of stevia, I find it very metallic also. Like what bothers me is the metallic aftertaste. Of course.
And this aftertaste that we have in this kind of products don't like, for me, don't like to create recipes, because then everything that you are going to taste when you are using this kind of polyols, you will have this kind of aftertaste that is not so interesting. And at the end, if we cannot create a recipe that is interesting in the tasting moment, it's not, for me, it's not, I'm not going to use them for this reason. But also, if we speak about xylitol or erythritol, in general, we use in order to replace sugar on the recipes. And we have to think first that sometimes maybe we can reduce and adjust the quantity of sugar on the recipe that we are using in order to have sweetness and to avoid to use too much sugar, because the problem that we have on the sugar on the recipes is that sometimes on the classic recipes we are using too much sugar because for the history of the recipes, and we don't know that we can adjust the sugar to the quantity that we need. And maybe it is amount when you are using 5, 6, 8% of sugar in a recipe is not so bad like when you are using 25%. That means that if I have to choose, I prefer to reduce the sugar and work with fibers on the recipe, for example, to balance. And also fibers, they are going to help us in order to avoid the rapid absorption of the sugars that on the digestion process. Now that means that, for example, if we have saccharose in a fruit, in this fruit we have fiber, for example, like passion fruit. When we are going to eat these sugars with a fiber, the absorption on the body and the glycemic index will increase, but not
in the same way.
On the same way. That means that there is ways to balance the recipe and to avoid the use of this kind of products. And also for me, it's something that is important that we don't have history behind these products are quite new, and we don't know how will affect on the future to the people that is going to consume these products every day.
Exactly. In general, we work less with sugar alcohols and with alternative. We work more with fibers with sweetening capacity than with sugar alcohols. I saw a question that was interesting about how do we calculate. It was Cyprian who was asking us, how do we calculate the water catching capacity of sugars and fibers in a recipe? It's a very I like this very scientific question. Like, how can we measure it? Well. To be honest, like water catching capacity is not exactly a parameter as easy to determine as sugar solubility or the freezing depression, right? The freezing point depression, when you can calculate for each sugar, like how many degrees, like you need to lower, right, the freezing temperature so that it freezes just like, so that it reaches its freezing temperature. It's not the same parameter even as let's say sweetness, right? There are no tables that will give you, like, let's say numbers. Guar gum 190 points of water catching capacity, locust bean gum, I don't know, let's say 40 or 50. It's more like comparative studies that are being made, and just like from these comparative studies you can say something about the water catching capacities of these ingredients. Also, we do those little studies ourselves, sometimes taking just water and the same percentage of each of the ingredients, and like we observe, right, like the texture, the viscosity, just to understand a little something about the water catching capacity. For example, if we're working with a new fiber and we want to know its thickening capacity, its water catching capacity, that's what we would do, because we want to know, does it have more water catching capacity than inulin or than citrus fiber, or less, or more or less the same. So it's a subjective, let's say it's a bit of a subjective measurement, but what you can know is that the molecular structure, if you're interested in let's say going a little bit deeper, what we do in our online course, but like what we don't want to bore you with right now, because maybe not everyone is so interested with the chemical right details of each ingredient. When you know the molecular structure of a gum, for example, a guar gum, right, or locust bean gum, so you know how many units of, let's say, of those simple sugars, like, right, you can have in those gums. So how long are the chains, right, of the fiber chains? And this also tells you something about the water catching capacity of this fiber, and also if it's like linear or if it has a lot of ramifications, right? Because it also, like how the geometry of the molecule tells you about the water catching capacity. So there are lots of details and lots of things that can help you, let's say, deduct. But mostly we also use, you know, technical books and chemical books to just learn about those ingredients, and then we run tests just to test if it's what the book says.
Here, Adrianna, we have a question from Konstantinos, and I'm not sure if this is the answer, but the question is, could you relate somehow the activity water in a recipe with the water catchment capacity of a recipe? I think that this question goes in the direction, what is the difference between the water catchment capacity and the activity of water.
Of course, well, somehow the activity of water is also very related with the free water, right? So of course that there is this relation, because more free water you will have, more water activity, exactly, more
higher,
exactly, the higher the number you will get. So of course there is a relation, but I'm not sure.
That means that, for example, we can explain an example that we do in our course, that is, for example, a classic chocolate mousse that has a lot of dry extract, that has a lot of fat sugars inside of the recipe, and in that mousse we have, for example, 0.85 activity water, that is a high number of activity water. That means that this product, the shelf life is more or less for the quantity of sugar that we have and the pH that we have. The shelf life can be 2 or 3 days if we have this product on contact with the atmosphere, and if this product is well packed, we can keep more days, but will be like this activity water. And then, for example, in the same recipe, if we are going to add inulin, for example, that has much more water catchment capacity, for example, than the sugar that we can use in a classic recipe, we are going to reduce a little bit the activity water, and this is going to help us to preserve a little bit better this Mousse, for example. But it's just a simple example that to understand that on the activity waters there is different parameters that we need to control. One is the water catchment capacity that we have of these ingredients that we are using in order to create a balance on the recipe. Then the techniques that we are using, for example, when we are going to prepare a ganache for chocolate bonbon, is not the same to work with an emulsification that is on a perfect process and we have a perfect emulsification than if we don't have this emulsification on the perfect preparation, I mean on the perfect process. And then we have to control also the pH that we have on the recipe. That means that lower will be the pH on the recipe, the better shelf life we will have. And then we have the temperature of shelf life in order to keep this product on the right shelf life. No, it's not the same to keep this product, for example, at 4 degrees that keep this product at 20 degrees. That will be, for the bacteria, for example, will be easier to increase. And also the percentage of sugar that we have here, because sugar also is going to help us to preserve the product. I mean, I think that is a little bit of all this information that we have to consider.
Of course, because when I think about those two parameters, I separate them a little bit in the sense that like water activity, right? I mean, in the product, like I'm testing, right? Like how much water activity do I have in the mousse? And then inside water catching capacity is a parameter that I will discuss, like talking about this ingredient, right? Like so my ingredient, how much water catching capacity does it have? But just like you said, Jordi, of course there are correlations, and it's related. It's just like maybe not directly related, since we cannot also always know to the for sure like any number of water catching capacity, as we don't have the assigned value for water catching capacity.
Well,
if we have
more questions.
Any questions that we left unanswered, please let us know. And if not, we just want to remind you, and for those who ask very technical scientific questions, that if you're interested, we have our online extended online B-Concept pastry course, where we talk about all of these ingredients, pastry molecules, pastry techniques. We present molecular structure of all that we talked about today, and then also where you learn to formulate your own recipes and to balance them. So the course, the next edition in English, starts in 20 days, exactly. So if you have any question about the course, or you want to receive a course syllabus, it's on our website, but you can also write to us at info@jordibordas.com, or just look on the website. There's all information that you need there. And was a pleasure. Yes, that's it for today. It was a pleasure. We hope you enjoyed and that you learned everything you wanted to know about
Tomorrow we are going to send to you the 2 recipes of raspberry mousse, and the graphic that we used during the presentation. And that's it. Thank you very much for your time, and keep safe, and see you soon. Okay? Thank you very much. Bye.